They called it le Banquet de minuit, the midnight banquet. To the common people of France, it was just a rumor whispered in candle-lit taverns that the King of France, behind the gilded doors of Versailles, hosted feasts not for pleasure, but for power. Feasts where the plates were made of gold, the guests were chosen by blood, and the main course was terror. They said if your name appeared on the guest list, you were either being rewarded or condemned. Some emerged from that dinner rich beyond imagination. Others were never seen again. At midnight, the palace transformed. The grand mirrors reflected more than light. Servants carried trays of wine so dark it looked like blood. Musicians played slow, haunting tunes. The king sat at the head of the table, his face glowing under the chandeliers, calm, radiant, unreadable. And around him sat those who dared not speak, dared not breathe too loudly, for they knew the night could turn from celebration to execution in a single glance. This is not just the story of decadence, it is the story of control, of how one man turned fear into loyalty and luxury into a weapon. Before we begin, if you believe history's most unsettling truths should never be forgotten, the tragedies, the madness, the fragile line between opulence and cruelty, subscribe. Because this story, like all dark legends, begins with beauty and ends in silence. Versailles was never silent, even when the candles burned low and the music had stopped. The air itself seemed to hum with ghosts. The marble floors remembered the steps of kings. The mirrors reflected faces long dead. And somewhere, beyond the golden corridors and sleeping chambers, a single candelabra would flicker to life. It was always the same. Midnight. A bell would toll from the far end of the palace, not the grand chime of ceremony, but a low, secret note felt more than heard. Servants stirred. Doors opened without creak. The chosen few, courtiers, ministers, mistresses, began their slow, rehearsed procession toward the Hall of Mirrors. They spoke in whispers, their silk shoes whispering even softer, for they all knew that the king did not summon company for pleasure. He summoned them for display. By day, Versailles was a paradise of light, fountains and music, powdered wigs, and the scent of roses carried through open windows. But at night, it became something else. The mirrors that had dazzled the court now reflected endless rows of candles, bending their light until the room seemed to shimmer with fever. Shadows clung to the walls like listening spirits. Every reflection doubled the dread. And at the center of it all, upon a long table gleaming like the surface of a lake, lay the setting for le Banquet de minuit. It was not a feast for hunger. It was theater. Each dish was chosen for its symbolism. Swans carved from sugar for purity. Pheasants dyed crimson for courage. Fish sculpted into crowns for loyalty. Even the wine was coded. A pale rosé for those in favor. A dark claret for those the king watched more closely. To be invited was both an honor and a sentence. They came dressed in their finest, their faces powdered to perfection, their smiles painted with terror. The men bowed until their wigs trembled. The women curtsied until their bones ached. Every movement had meaning. Every glance could wound. At Versailles, survival depended not on strength, but on grace. And when the king entered, the room itself seemed to hold its breath. Louis XIV, the Sun King, walked with the serenity of a god who had made his own heaven. His coat shimmered, with gold thread, his cuffs embroidered with pearls, his hair cascading like rays of sunlight even in candlelight. But what most remembered were his eyes, calm, precise, and merciless. They could bless or destroy. And no one knew which until it was too late. He sat at the head of the table. The courtiers followed, trembling beneath their smiles. The orchestra began to play, slow, deliberate notes that filled the silence like a warning. The king lifted his glass. "To those who serve," he said, his voice velvet, his tone absolute. It was not a toast. It was a command. They drank. And so began the ritual that would define the French court for decades. A dinner where no one dared to eat first, where laughter was rehearsed, and where the fate of ministers, generals, and lovers could change, with a single raised eyebrow. Behind the curtains, servants moved like shadows, silent, efficient, invisible. They were trained to glide barefoot, to never meet the king's gaze, to anticipate every whim before it was spoken. Some said the Akiyam. Same servants attended every banquet for years, bound to secrecy. Others whispered that the king preferred new ones for each feast, to ensure no living soul carried too much memory of what was said. The dishes kept coming. Roast peacock with gilded feathers, honeyed fruit floating in crystal bowls, meat, so tender it could be cut with a spoon. Yet few tasted anything. The courtiers' throats were too tight with fear. The king's attention moved from face to face like a flame, testing, consuming. He would ask questions, simple ones, almost kind. "How fares your estate, monsieur?" "Your husband travels often, does he not, madame?" Each reply was weighed, each pause recorded, for at le Banquet de minuit, every answer was an oath. There were stories, unspoken, but known, of a marquis who misspoke during a toast and was sent to the Bastille by sunrise, of a duchess whose trembling hand spilled wine on the king's sleeve and was found ill the next morning, of ministers who laughed too long, too loudly, and were quietly removed from the next invitation. The courtiers understood. The banquet was not about food. It was about obedience. When the final dish was cleared, and the last note of music faded, the king would rise without warning. The guests followed instantly. A single heartbeat late was noticed. He would nod once, perhaps smile faintly, and retreat through a side door, leaving the hall bathed in dying candlelight. Only then did the courtiers breathe again. The moment he vanished, the silence collapsed into frantic whispers. They compared glances, dissected gestures, weighed every syllable he had spoken. Had he smiled more at one guest than another? Had he avoided someone entirely? In Versailles, the smallest detail could shape a destiny. Outside, the night deepened. The fountains froze mid-song. The moon hung pale above the golden roof, and somewhere, within those endless corridors, servants carried away the untouched plates of food, silver still warm, wine still full, to be buried in the gardens, as if the very excess of the meal were too sacred or too cursed to remain. By dawn, the mirrors were polished, the halls restored to their perfection. But the fear lingered. The courtiers who survived the banquet carried it like a fever, the knowledge that beneath the glitter of Versailles, they lived in a cage of gold. And as they bowed before the rising sun, they knew the truth that no one dared speak. When the king commanded darkness, even light obeyed. Louis XIV understood something his enemies never did, that fear, when dressed in beauty, becomes devotion. He did not rule merely through decree or army, but through ritual. The kingdom of France was not just governed, it was choreographed. Every motion of the court, every flicker of candlelight, every moment of his life was a performance designed to remind all who watched that the king was not a man, but a sun around which the world revolved. The midnight banquet was the most secret of his rituals. To understand it, one must first understand the religion of his daily life, the theater of monarchy. At dawn, he was worshipped. The ritual was called le lever du roi, the king's rising. Courtiers gathered in silence outside his bedchamber, before sunrise, waiting for the honor of seeing him wake. The highest-ranking nobles helped him dress, layer by layer, as if clothing the divine, to hand him a sleeve, to pass him a jewel, to buckle his shoes. Each act was worth more than... even his breakfast was ceremony, every bite, a privilege observed by dozens of eyes. And when the day ended, when the sun sank behind the gilded gardens, another ritual began. Le coucher du roi, the king's bedtime. Once again, nobles gathered to watch him undress, to ensure that his sleep, too, was royal. But the midnight banquet existed between those rituals, in the dark space where the king's divinity met his humanity, and where both terrified his court. The invitations arrived without warning. A sealed letter, delivered at dusk by a page wearing the royal crest. It was said that even before breaking the wax, the recipient could feel the weight of fate in the envelope. The parchment bore only the words, "You are summoned to the table of His Majesty. Midnight." No one declined. Each invitation was both promise and threat. To be summoned meant the king remembered you. To be forgotten meant you were already dead in all but name. And so, as the sun fell behind the trees of Versailles, the chosen would prepare. The women painted their faces until they glowed like porcelain masks. The men rehearsed their bows, their smiles, their words of loyalty. Hearts pounded beneath brocade. The air reeked of perfume, powder, and panic. The servants, too, prepared, though none of them ever spoke of it. They polished the silver until it reflected faces like mirrors, wiped every glass thrice, burned rosemary and sage in the hall to purify the air. Before each banquet, a priest quietly blessed the table. Some said it was to sanctify the meal. Others whispered it was to ward off whatever darkness the king carried within him. When Louis entered, all eyes fell. His gaze was soft, his smile practiced, but his presence was suffocating. Those who stood too close claimed to feel the air change. Warmer, heavier, as if the very walls acknowledged him. To speak first in his presence was unthinkable. One waited to be spoken to, as though awaiting divine permission to exist, at the Har. Midnight banquet. Everything mattered. The sequence of dishes was as symbolic as a chess match. Roasted quail, loyalty. Grapes soaked in honey, temptation. A golden apple placed before a guest meant favor. A black pearl hidden in one's cup meant exile. These were the unspoken codes of the Sun King's table, passed through the generations of servants who dared not record them. And the music, always the same. A slow, mournful minuet played on violins so soft it seemed to come from another world. The rhythm was hypnotic, a heartbeat for the night. Some guests swore that the melody never ended, that it continued even when the feast was over, following them into their dreams. No one knew how long these banquets lasted. Time lost meaning in the golden glow. Hours passed in murmured conversation, in anxious laughter. Sometimes the king spoke of philosophy, art, astronomy, topics that seemed harmless until his words turned sharp. "What is loyalty?" he once asked, "when it is born of fear?" No one answered. The silence lasted until a woman fainted. The king smiled. Another time, he ordered a jester to perform, then dismissed him mid-song for offending the ear of God. The man was never seen again. But the cruelty was not always open. Often, it was subtle, psychological, surgical. He would ask account about his son's education, only to reveal he had already arranged the boy's appointment to a distant regiment. He would praise a minister for loyalty, then quietly transfer his titles to another. To dine with Louis XIV was to dine with a mirror. Every word reflected, every flaw illuminated. And yet, they loved him. They adored him, because he gave them purpose. Because he was the sun, and without him, they were nothing but shadows. After each banquet, the guests would return to their chambers trembling, their stomachs untouched, their faces stiff from false smiles. Some wept in private. Others stared at their reflection until dawn, trying to understand why they had survived another night, when so many before them had not. But the next time the invitation arrived, every one of them would come again. For to live in Versailles was to live inside a dream, dazzling, poisonous, eternal. And to refuse the king's invitation was to wake up, and waking up meant death. It was a winter evening in 1682 when the most infamous of the midnight banquets took place, the night that would be remembered in whispers as La Nuit des Murmures, the night of whispers. The court had grown uneasy. Beyond Versailles' gilded gates, the kingdom was restless. The wars had drained France's coffers, famine stalked the countryside, and rumors spread like wildfire that the king's inner circle was plotting against him. The courtiers smiled by day, bowed by habit, but beneath their powdered calm, fear had begun to ferment, and Louis XIV could smell fear the way others smelled perfume. That night, his invitation was delivered to only 12 guests. 12. A number chosen not by chance, but by design. It echoed the apostles of Christ, a subtle reminder that Louis considered himself divine. But unlike Christ's supper, there would be no salvation here, only revelation. The chosen 12 were gathered in the Hall of Mirrors before midnight. The chandeliers had been lowered, casting fractured light across the floor. The mirrors shimmered like sheets of black water. It was said that the guests' reflections looked older that night, tired, trembling, distorted, as if the mirrors were showing not their faces, but their fears. At the stroke of 12, the doors opened. Louis entered slowly, dressed not in his usual gold, but in deep crimson velvet, the color of blood and royalty alike. His jewels caught the candlelight and threw it across the room like sparks from a flame. Behind him walked 2 masked attendants carrying silver trays. No one dared to ask what they held. "Mes amis," the king said softly, his tone warm, almost tender. "Tonight, we dine not as ruler and subjects, but as truth and deception." A murmur ran through the table, unease cloaked in nervous laughter. The king smiled, and that was far more terrifying than anger. The feast began. The dishes were lavish as always: roasted pheasant glazed in honey, lamb perfumed with saffron, pastries shaped like crowns. But the courtiers barely touched their food. The air felt thick, the music too slow. Each time the king raised his glass, they followed in trembling unison, like puppets mimicking a god. Then came the toasts. The king invited each guest to stand and raise their glass to the glory of France. It began innocently enough, praises for his reign, declarations of loyalty rehearsed and hollow. But as the procession continued, the atmosphere began to shift. The king's eyes were no longer calm. They were searching, dissecting, devouring. When the Duc de la Trémoille rose to speak, his voice shook. "To our eternal sovereign," he said, "whose light banishes the shadows of treachery." The king tilted his head. "Shadows?" he repeated softly. "And yet the court seems darker of late. Do you not think so, monsieur?" The Duke's Tatside hand trembled. "Majesty, Louis smiled faintly. "Drink." The Duke obeyed. Moments later he began to cough, softly at first, then violently. The room froze. His wineglass shattered on the floor. He fell to his knees, gasping, his eyes wide with terror. The king did not move. He merely watched, his fingers resting lightly on the tablecloth. When the Duke collapsed, the king whispered, to no one in particular, "Poison is such an ugly word. Fear does the work more cleanly." No one breathed. At last, Louis stood. "Let this be a lesson," he said quietly. "The sun has no need of darkness. Those who conspire against its light are consumed by it." The body was carried away. The banquet continued. The courtiers ate nothing. No one dared speak. The violins played on, their melody trembling like a dying heartbeat. The servants poured more wine. Dark, red, thick. It looked almost alive beneath the candles. By the end of the night, 2 others had fainted. Whether from terror or something more sinister, no one ever knew. But something changed in Versailles after that banquet. The laughter grew more forced. The court grew smaller, quieter. Men who had once boasted of their closeness to the king began to avoid his gaze. Women stopped wearing red, whispering that the color invited his attention. And his attention, they said, was death. The next morning, when the king appeared for his lever du roi, he was radiant as ever. "The sun," he declared, "shines brightest after a storm." The courtiers bowed lower than ever, but as they rose, none dared meet his eyes, for they all understood the truth of the previous night. The king did not fear traitors. He created them, and in doing so, he made loyalty itself a weapon. From that day on, every whisper in Versailles was dangerous. The air in the corridors seemed to carry secrets, and those who spoke too freely were gone before dawn. The midnight banquet continued, but fewer returned from it unchanged. The palace had always been golden. Now, it glittered with something colder, paranoia. Even the servants began to say the same words when the torches were extinguished at night. The king is awake. And that, in Versailles, was the most terrifying thing of all. Long after the reign of Louis XIV ended, Versailles refused to sleep. The mirrors still caught the moonlight. The halls still whispered. And though the Sun King had gone to dust, his rituals had not died with him. They lingered, like perfume, trapped in the fabric of old silk, faint but inescapable. Those who came after him, the courtiers of his heirs, the servants who inherited his silence, began to speak of strange things that happened after midnight. It began, as curses often do, with a sound. At first it was faint, the distant toll of a bell, though no bell was rung. Then, the echo of footsteps in empty corridors, measured and deliberate, like the pacing of a monarch late to his own funeral. Servants assigned to the Hall of Mirrors swore that sometimes the chandeliers began to sway, though the air was still. Candles flickered to life on their own, one by one, as if unseen hands were lighting the room for a feast that would never end. And then came the music. It was soft, almost imperceptible, a thread of melody winding through the silence. A single violin, a waltz too slow for dancing. It rose from nowhere and vanished just as suddenly, leaving behind a hush so deep it made the living hold their breath. Some said it was memory. Others said it was guilt. But those who had served the Sun King, those few who had survived the midnight banquets and lived long enough to see another reign, whispered that the king had never truly left. They said his shadow still walked the corridors, inspecting the mirrors, looking for the reflection he had once seen of himself, radiant, eternal, feared. And sometimes, when the palace was empty, when the moonlight spilled across the marble floors like milk, that reflection looked back. The curse of the midnight banquet was not a ghost in chains or a scream in the dark. It was subtler, more human. It was the feeling that someone was always watching. A century later, when the revolution came, the people stormed Versailles with fury in their hearts and justice on their tongues. They tore down the tapestries, smashed the mirrors, looted the gold. But even as the palace fell to ruin, they left the Hall of Mirrors untouched. No one dared step too close to that long table where so many had once trembled. One soldier, a young man barely 20, claimed that as he crossed the threshold, he heard the faint clink of glass, the rustle of silk, and a voice, calm, commanding, unmistakable, say, "Sit." He dropped his torch and fled. The flame spread, charring the gilded doors but leaving the hall itself unburned. The marble gleamed through the smoke as if the fire had bowed before it. The legends multiplied. In the decades that followed, guests who visited the abandoned palace spoke of strange occurrences. Painters who came to sketch the ruins claimed to see figures moving in the mirrors, elegant silhouettes in powdered wigs, frozen mid-laughter. Caretakers swore that every year on the anniversary of the king's death, the chandeliers lit themselves at midnight. In 1795, a historian named Jean-Baptiste Roux broke into the Hall of Mirrors to see the truth for himself. He brought with him ink, paper, and a candle. At precisely midnight, he recorded hearing a sound like crystal chiming. Faint, rhythmic, deliberate. When he turned, his candlelight caught the faintest reflection of a man seated at the head of an invisible table, his face hidden by shadow, his hands folded in front of him. Roux ran. His notes ended mid-sentence. He looked at me, not as a ghost, but as a king. He never returned to Versailles. Even in modern times, when the palace became a museum and the tourists came in flocks, the staff avoided the hall after hours. The cleaning crews refused to work past midnight. The curators would not meet each other's eyes when the lights flickered. One guard, an old man who had worked there for 30 years, said that sometimes, on certain nights, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, and the mirrors fogged as if someone were breathing behind the glass. "It's not haunting," he said. "It's remembering." Because Versailles, in all its splendor, was built not just of marble and gold, but of fear. And fear never dies. It sleeps. It waits. It repeats itself. Even now, if you stand in the Hall of Mirrors at midnight, the silence feels too perfect. The kind of silence that hides something listening. You might hear footsteps. You might hear music. You might see a single candle flicker to life with no hand to light it. And if you stay long enough, you might hear a voice, warm, regal, eternal, whisper in your ear. "Sit, my friend. The feast is about to begin." And when you turn, there will be no one there, only your reflection, and, in its eyes, the faintest glimmer of a crown. Versailles still gleams, but it no longer shines. To the thousands who walk its halls today, the palace is a museum, a relic of beauty, a monument to what once was. They come for the gold, the mirrors, the fountains that dance to hidden pipes. But if they listen closely, past the hum of cameras and the shuffle of tourists, they can hear it still. That faint, almost imperceptible hum beneath the air. The sound of fear that never left. Because the legacy of the midnight banquet was never about ghosts. It was about power, what it does to those who hold it, and what it turns those beneath it into. Louis XIV had crafted his empire like a stage. His courtiers were actors, his palace the theater of submission. The midnight banquet was its climax, the nightly rehearsal of his divinity, a ritual so intoxicating, so cruelly beautiful, that even centuries later, France could not fully escape its shadow. When the revolution finally came, when the people tore down the monarchy and filled the streets with the roar of vengeance, they were not only destroying a king, they were destroying the idea that a man could make himself God. Yet even revolution did not end the performance. Those who rose after the fall, the ministers, the generals, the new emperors, they all played the same game, only on a different stage. They too learned to feed on fear, to use spectacle as control. The Sun King's lessons were never truly buried, they were inherited, because Louis XIV's greatest invention was not Versailles. It was the illusion that power could be absolute. He had discovered something terrifyingly simple. If you make people live in awe long enough, they will mistake it for love. And so his courtiers had bowed. They had smiled, laughed, and toasted through terror. until they forgot the difference between loyalty and survival. The midnight banquet was not merely a dinner, it was a test of humanity. Who could pretend longest? Who could hide fear beneath etiquette? Who could lie with grace? History tells us the banquet ended with his death. But history lies. The ritual continues in every room where people smile while afraid. Every boardroom, every courtroom, every throne disguised as a table. The faces change, the chandeliers are electric now, but the fear, that ancient shimmering obedience, remains the same. Perhaps that is why the legend refuses to die. Visitors claim that on rare nights, those when the moon aligns perfectly with the Hall of Mirrors, something strange happens. The air grows heavy. The reflection in the mirrors deepens. For a moment, the gilded room seems to breathe again, and those standing alone in the hall swear they see others in the glass. Faces from another time, beautifully dressed, silently, watching. The guides laugh it off. The historians smile politely. But deep down, even the skeptics feel it. That unsettling chill that comes not from the supernatural, but from memory. Because Versailles does not haunt with spirits. It haunts with truth. The truth that beauty and cruelty can wear the same mask. That a crown can blind even the brightest mind. That fear, once learned, becomes inheritance. Louis XIV's banquet was not a curse of ghosts, but a curse of imitation. Each generation that came after him, kings, queens, emperors, tried to become what he was, adored, untouchable, eternal. Yet each failed in the same way. They mistook fear for reverence. They mistook silence for peace. And in that mistake, they sealed their own doom. The French court fell because it could no longer tell the difference between obedience and hatred. The very rituals that once kept power alive eventually suffocated it. The laughter at the king's table turned to screams. In the streets, the mirrors that once reflected perfection would soon reflect the guillotine's blade. But in the dark, when the palace empties and the wind slips through the corridors, the king's presence lingers, not as punishment, but as warning. To every ruler who believes themselves untouchable. To every soul who forgets that love born of fear is only another form of death. There, beneath the chandeliers, amid the endless reflections, the invisible feast goes on. The table gleams, the candles burn, and somewhere, a voice, calm, measured, eternal, whispers, "The sun does not set. It only watches." The air trembles, the gold walls sigh, and the mirrors shimmer one last time, showing not the faces of courtiers or kings, but ours, for the banquet was never just his, it was humanity's. And as long as we keep mistaking fear for order, beauty for mercy, and silence for peace, the candles will keep lighting themselves at midnight. Thy king will always sit at the head of the table, and the rest of us will keep pretending to smile.